This 1867 portrait of a teacher looks calm until you notice the empty desk. At first glance, it seemed like exactly what it was supposed to be, a proud record of progress, a classroom full of children learning to read. But one detail in the corner of the frame refused to stay quiet. And once Eleanor Marsh noticed it, she could not look away. Eleanor was a paper conservator at a historical society in Charleston, South Carolina. She had spent 11 years handling fragile documents and photographs, carefully stabilizing the physical evidence of the past. Most of her work was routine: foxed letters, crumbling ledgers, cabinet cards with silver mirroring along the edges. She knew how to separate sentiment from analysis. She knew how to look at an image and see chemistry, light exposure, paper stock. But this photograph was different. It had arrived in a cardboard box from an estate sale in Beaufort County, part of a larger donation that included receipts, a family Bible, and a bundle of letters tied with twine. The Historical Society had accepted the collection without much fanfare. Eleanor's job was to assess condition and recommend storage. She was not supposed to get involved in interpretation. The photograph was a cabinet card, roughly 4 inches by 6, mounted on cream-colored stock with a decorative border. The studio stamp on the back read, J. H. Whitman, photographer, Beaufort, SC. The image showed a classroom. Wooden benches arranged in rows, a pot-bellied stove in the corner, a chalkboard on the wall with the alphabet written across it in careful script. And at the front of the room, standing beside a simple wooden desk, a woman in a dark dress with a white collar. Her hands were folded. Her expression was composed, even serene. She looked like exactly what the caption on the back said she was. Miss A. Crane, teacher, 1867. The children sat in neat rows, their faces serious, their postures stiff in the way that long exposure times demanded. They were black children, most of them between 6 and 12 years old. Their clothes were clean but patched. Some held slates, some held primers. All of them looked directly at the camera as if they understood that this moment was supposed to mean something. Eleanor had seen photographs like this before. Freedmen's schools were a common subject in Reconstruction-era photography. Northern missionary societies funded many of these schools, and photographs served as fundraising tools, proof that the work was succeeding. The images were meant to inspire donations. They were meant to say, look, they can learn, they are learning, this is progress. But something in this photograph did not fit. Eleanor noticed it on her second pass, after she had logged the item in the database and set it aside for housing. She was sliding the card into an archival sleeve when her eye caught the left side of the frame. There, in the second row, was a desk with no one sitting at it. The bench was empty, the writing slate. On the desk was blank except for a small dark object resting on its surface. And, carved into the wood of the desk, just visible in the light, were 2 initials, S.J. She pulled the photograph back out. She adjusted her magnifying lamp. The initials were crude but deliberate, scratched into the wood with something sharp. And the object on the slate, she realized, was not a smudge or a flaw in the emulsion. It was a flower. A small, wilted flower, placed there with obvious intention. Eleanor looked at the teacher's hands. They were not simply folded. Her left hand was extended slightly, her fingers pointing toward the empty desk. It was subtle, the kind of thing a casual viewer would never notice. But once Eleanor saw it, she could not unsee it. This was not just a portrait of a classroom. It was a portrait of an absence. Someone was supposed to be sitting at that desk, and the teacher wanted whoever looked at this photograph to know it. Eleanor had been doing this work long enough to recognize when a photograph was asking to be investigated. Most of the time, she resisted. Her job was preservation, not research. But every few years, an image came across her table that refused to be filed away. This was one of those images. She started with the obvious questions. Who was Miss A. Crane? Who were the children in the photograph? And who was supposed to be sitting at the desk marked S.J.? The estate sale paperwork was unhelpful. The collection had belonged to a family named Hartwell, descendants of a prominent Beaufort County planter. The box had been found in an attic, untouched for decades. No one in the current generation knew anything about a photograph of a freedmen's school. They assumed it had been kept as a curiosity, or perhaps acquired at some later date. Eleanor turned to the photographer's stamp. J.H. Whitman was not a name she recognized, but a search through historical directories confirmed that a James Henry Whitman had operated a photography studio in Beaufort from 1865 to 1871. He was a northern transplant, one of many who had come south after the war to document the changes taking place. His other surviving photographs included portraits of Union officers, newly freed families, and several images of Freedmen's Bureau officials. He seemed to have sympathies with the Republican project of Reconstruction. But the photograph had ended up in the possession of a planter family. That was the first contradiction. Eleanor reached out to a colleague at the University of South Carolina, a historian named Dr. Marcus Trent, who specialized in the Reconstruction era. She sent him a high-resolution scan of the image and asked if he could help identify the school or the teacher. He called her back within 2 days. "I know this school," he said, "or at least I think I do. There was a Freedmen's Bureau school in St. Helena Parish near Beaufort that operated from 1865 to 1868. It was run by the American Missionary Association. The teacher's name was Abigail Crane. She was from Massachusetts." Eleanor felt a small jolt of recognition. What happened to her? She went back north in 1868. There's a letter in the AMA archives where she describes her reasons for leaving. She said she could no longer bear to teach in a place where her students kept disappearing. Disappearing? That's the word she used. I always assumed she meant families migrating, children being pulled out to work. But I never looked into it closely. It was a footnote in a larger project. He paused. "Why are you asking?" Eleanor described the empty desk, the initials, the flower, the teacher's hand. Dr. Trent was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think you need to come see the AMA records, and I think we need to find out who S.J. was." The American Missionary Association had been one of the largest organizations funding freedmen's schools in the South. Their archives, now held at a research center in New Orleans, contained thousands of letters, reports, and administrative records from teachers in the field. Dr. Trent arranged access, and Eleanor flew down to examine the materials in person. The file on the St. Helena Parish School was thin but revealing. Abigail Crane had arrived in South Carolina in the fall of 1865, just months after the war ended. She was 24 years old, a graduate of a normal school in Massachusetts, and deeply committed to the cause of educating the formerly enslaved. Her early letters were optimistic. She described her students as eager, intelligent, and hungry for knowledge. She wrote about teaching them to read the Bible, to write their names, to do simple arithmetic. She believed she was doing holy work. But by 1867, her tone had changed. In a letter dated March of that year, she wrote, "I have lost another student this week. Samuel Jennings, age 9, was taken from his mother by order of the county court. They say he has been apprenticed to a Mr. Hartwell, who claims the boy's labor is owed to him. His mother wept at my door, but there was nothing I could do. The laws here are designed to return these children to bondage under another name." Eleanor stopped reading. Hartwell. The name on the estate sale paperwork, the name of the family that had for over a century kept this photograph in their attic. She read on. Abigail Crane's letters documented a pattern. Between 1866 and 1868, at least 7 of her students were removed from the school and apprenticed to white planters under the provisions of South Carolina's Black Codes. The codes, passed in 1865, allowed local courts to declare black children orphans or vagrants and bind them to white employers until they reached adulthood. Parents had little recourse. The courts were run by former Confederates. The system was designed to restore, as closely as possible, the labor arrangements of slavery. Samuel Jennings was one of those children. His mother, a woman named Celia Jennings, had been enslaved on the Hartwell plantation before the war. She had gained her freedom in 1865 and moved with her son to a settlement near the Freedmen's School. For 2 years, Samuel attended classes. He learned to read. He learned to write. He carved his initials into his desk. And then, in March of 1867, a man named Thomas Hartwell filed a petition with the county court claiming that Samuel was an orphan and that his labor was needed on the Hartwell farm. The court agreed. Samuel was taken from his mother and bound as an apprentice until the age of 21. Abigail Crane protested. She wrote to the Freedmen's Bureau. She wrote to her supervisors at the AMA. She wrote to newspapers in the North. But the legal machinery ground on. Samuel was gone. The photograph, Eleanor realized, had been taken just weeks after Samuel's removal. Abigail Crane had commissioned it herself, according to a receipt in the AMA files. She had paid J.H. Whitman to document her classroom, empty desk and all. She had placed a flower on Samuel's slate. She had pointed her hand toward the space where he should have been. And then somehow, the photograph had ended up in the possession of the very family that had taken him. Dr. Trent helped Eleanor trace the photograph's journey. The most likely explanation was that Thomas Hartwell had acquired it after Abigail Crane left South Carolina. Perhaps he had purchased it from Whitman's estate. Perhaps he had taken it as a kind of trophy, proof that the old order could not be overturned so easily. Or perhaps he had simply found it and kept it without understanding its significance. But the photograph was only half the story. Eleanor needed to know what had happened to Samuel Jennings. The county court records were fragmentary. Many had been lost in a courthouse fire in 1892. But the Freedmen's Bureau records, now digitized and searchable, contained complaints filed by Celia Jennings in 1867 and 1868. She had petitioned the Bureau to intervene on her son's behalf. She had described the conditions on the Hartwell farm: long hours, inadequate food, physical punishment. She had begged for her son's return. The Bureau agent assigned to the case, a man named Lieutenant William Holt, had investigated. His report, dated August 1867, confirmed that Samuel was being held on the Hartwell property and that he showed signs of malnutrition and mistreatment. Holt recommended that the apprenticeship be dissolved and that Samuel be returned to his mother. The recommendation was ignored. The local court refused to act. Lieutenant Holt was reassigned to another district, and Samuel Jennings remained on the Hartwell farm. The last reference Eleanor could find to Samuel was in a plantation ledger from 1869. It was a list of laborers on the Hartwell property with notations about their work assignments and pay. Most of the names were followed by small sums, the pittances paid to sharecroppers and tenant farmers. But next to Samuel's name, there was no amount. Instead, there was a single word: deceased. No cause of death, no burial record, no further explanation. Samuel Jennings had been 9 years old when he was taken from his mother. He had died on the Hartwell farm before his 12th birthday. And for over 150 years, his photograph, the photograph of his empty desk, had sat in the attic of the family that had worked him to death. Eleanor brought her findings to the Historical Society's director, a woman named Patricia Ames, who had been in the role for nearly 2 decades. Patricia was a careful administrator, attentive to the Society's reputation and its relationships with donors. She listened to Eleanor's presentation in her corner office, the photograph projected on a screen beside them. "This is extraordinary work," Patricia said when Eleanor finished, "but I need to understand what you're proposing." Eleanor had prepared for this question. "I want to build an exhibition around this photograph, not just the image itself, but the system it reveals, the black codes, the apprenticeship laws, the way children were taken from their families and returned to forced labor. Samuel Jennings is one example, but there were thousands like him. This photograph is evidence." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "The Hartwell family is still prominent in this area. They've donated to this society in the past, not recently, but they're on our mailing list. They attend our events." "I'm not proposing we accuse anyone of anything," Eleanor said. "I'm proposing we tell the truth about what this photograph shows, the truth about what happened to a 9-year-old boy." "And you're certain about the identification? You're certain this is the Hartwell family?" "The name is in the Freedmen's Bureau records. It's in the court filings. It's in the plantation ledger. And the photograph was in their attic." Patricia looked at the image on the screen. The classroom, the children, the teacher with her hand extended toward the empty ticket. "Have you contacted the family?" "Not yet. I wanted to talk to you first." Patricia nodded slowly. "I think we need to bring this to the board, and I think we need to be prepared for pushback." The board meeting took place 3 weeks later. Eleanor presented her research to a room of 12 trustees, most of them older, most of them white, most of them connected to old low-country families in one way or another. She walked them through the photograph, the studio stamp, the AMA letters, the Freedmen's Bureau records, the plantation ledger. She showed them Samuel's initials carved into the desk. She showed them the flower on the slate. When she finished, the room was silent. The first trustee to speak was a man named Edward Gaillard, a retired attorney with a deep tan and a signet ring. "This is compelling," he said, "but I'm concerned about the framing. You're presenting this as a story about one family, one child, but the black codes were a statewide phenomenon. They were the law. Thomas Hartwell was operating within the legal system of his time. The legal system of his time was designed to perpetuate slavery under another name," Eleanor said. "That's exactly the point. But if we present it that way, we're making a judgment. We're saying this family was complicit in something evil." They were complicit. A child died on their property. His mother's complaints are in the federal records. Another trustee, a woman named Margaret Simmons, leaned forward. "I think we need to be careful about how we contextualize this. People today aren't responsible for what their ancestors did. If we turn this into an accusation, we'll lose half our membership." "I'm not asking anyone to take responsibility," Eleanor said. "I'm asking that we tell the truth about what this photograph shows. The Hartwell family kept this image for over a century. They kept it in their attic where no one could see it. Now we have a chance to let Samuel Jennings be seen, to let his story be told." Patricia Ames, who had remained quiet through the discussion, spoke up. "I've been thinking about this since Eleanor first brought it to me, and I keep coming back to the teacher, Abigail Crane. She commissioned this photograph. She placed that flower on the desk. She pointed her hand at the empty seat. She wanted someone someday to notice what was missing. She wanted someone to ask the question. I think we owe it to her, and to Samuel, to answer it." The vote was not unanimous. 3 trustees abstained and 1 voted against. But the majority approved Eleanor's proposal. The Historical Society would mount an exhibition centered on the photograph. They would tell the story of Samuel Jennings, his mother Celia, and the system that had stolen him from her. The exhibition opened 6 months later, in the spring. Eleanor had worked with Dr. Trent and a team of researchers to expand the story beyond the single photograph. They had found images of other freedmen's schools, other empty desks. They had documented dozens of apprenticeship cases from the Bureau records, children taken from their families and bound to white employers across the South. They had traced the long legal fight to dismantle the black codes, a fight that had taken decades and was never fully won. But the centerpiece of the exhibition was still the photograph of Miss A. Crane's classroom. It hung in a place of honor, enlarged and mounted on a wall beside a panel that told Samuel's story in full. Visitors could see the empty desk, the initials, the flower. They could read Celia Jennings's petitions to the Freedmen's Bureau. They could see the plantation ledger with her son's name and the single word that marked his death. The Historical Society had also reached out to descendants of Celia Jennings. Through a genealogist who specialized in African American family history, they had located a great-great-granddaughter living in Atlanta. Her name was Denise Rawlings, and she had agreed to attend the opening. Eleanor met her in the gallery, standing before the photograph. Denise was in her 60s, a retired schoolteacher herself. She had known almost nothing about Samuel before Eleanor's call. The family had stories about Celia, about her strength and her grief, but the details had been lost over generations. "She never stopped talking about him," Denise said, her eyes on the empty desk. "That's what came down through the family. She never stopped talking about her boy who was taken, but we didn't know his name. We didn't know what happened to him. We just knew he was gone." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "My grandmother used to say that the worst thing about slavery wasn't the work. It was that they could take your children. They could take your children and there was nothing you could do. And even after freedom came, they found ways to keep taking them." Eleanor did not know what to say. She stood beside Denise and looked at the photograph, at the teacher's hand pointing toward the place where a 9-year-old boy should have been. "Thank you," Denise said finally. "Thank you for finding him." The exhibition ran for 8 months. It drew visitors from across the state and coverage from national media. Some of the attention was positive. Historians praised the research. Educators brought their students. Descendants of other apprenticed children reached out to share their own family stories. But some of the attention was hostile. A local newspaper ran an editorial questioning the exhibition's agenda. A handful of donors withdrew their support. One member of the Hartwell family sent a letter demanding that the photograph be returned. Patricia Ames declined. The photograph, she wrote in her reply, was a historical document that had been legally acquired through an estate sale. It belonged to the public now. Its story deserved to be told. Eleanor read the letter and felt something settle in her chest. She had spent her career preserving the physical traces of the past, stabilizing paper and emulsion so that future generations could see what had been. But this was different. This was not just preservation. This was restoration, giving back to Samuel Jennings the presents that had been stolen from him, giving back to Celia Jennings the record of her loss. She thought about Abigail Crane, the young teacher from Massachusetts who had come south believing she could change the world. Abigail had watched her students disappear, one by one, into a system that called itself law. She had not been able to stop it, but she had found a way to mark it, to leave a trace that could not be erased. She had commissioned a photograph with an empty desk at its center. She had placed a flower where a child should have been, and she had trusted that someone, someday, would see what she was trying to say. It had taken 157 years, but someone had finally seen. There are thousands of photographs from the Reconstruction era still sitting in archives, attics, and museum collections across the country. Most of them look ordinary. Stiff poses, formal clothes, serious expressions. They look like documents of a hopeful time, a time when freedom seemed possible and education was the key to the future. But look closer. Look at the hands, the backgrounds, the edges of the frame. Look at what is missing. Somewhere in those images are the children who were taken, the families that were torn apart, the schools that were burned, the teachers who were driven out, the promises that were broken before the ink was dry. We have been taught to see these photographs as relics of progress, but some of them are evidence of something else entirely. They are records of theft, of violence, of a system that refused to let go of its grip on human lives. The people who took these photographs knew what they were documenting. Some of them were trying to tell us. They were leaving clues in the composition, in the small details that would not make sense until someone cared enough to look. Abigail Crane left a flower on a desk. She pointed her hand at an empty seat. She waited for someone to ask the question she could not answer alone. Now, when you look at an old photograph, you might find yourself looking a little longer. You might notice the things that do not quite fit, the hand that is positioned strangely, the space where someone should be, the object that seems out of place, and you might start to wonder who is missing from the frame.